I was excited, actually, because I was talking to the person I'm going to introduce, and we were chatting on about his rather beautiful jacket, and I was stroking it. Now, it's a great privilege. Well, he did say, actually, he likes to wear things that make people want to touch him, and I thought, well, who's going to refuse that? As I got out my crampons and my climbing frame. He's enormous. Now, and it's a huge privilege to introduce him, because he's a trailblazer in his own sport. Not only did he have a stellar career as one of the US's most prominent stars of the NBA, but he made history in 2007 after his retirement by coming out. And he has thus become one of the most highly profile gay athletes in the world. He's been a remarkable mentor, role model, and contributor ever since. Playing for England in the Commonwealth Games in Melbourne, he made 18 caps for his country. Now retired from sport, John works with organizations in the US and Europe to help them to assess and manage, maximize, and retain their human capital. He's much sought after for his contribution to helping brands understanding how to use cause marketing and corporate social responsibility as a client and personal engagement tool. He also dedicates his life to his charitable work with the National Literacy Trust, NSPCC, and the establishment of the ABC Foundation to encourage children to become involved in sport and their community. He's been honoured both by Manchester Metropolitan University with an honorary degree of Doctor of Science and by the Queen with an OBE. He's a global sports star, a major gay campaigner, and a tireless worker for literacy and human rights. My friends, will you welcome John Amaechi.
Feel free to. Good evening, good evening. I've been toying with what I want to talk about, really. What I want to talk about is last night, where I learned a lesson about going out with people from Ernst & Young. Huge mistake. The reason I can't talk about it is because I don't remember much of it. So I won't bother with that. So my job here, I suppose, is to tell a few stories. I've got 15 minutes, apparently, or however long I want, because I'm 6'9". And so I'm going to tell you a few stories. To preface it, all the other stuff, I was not a really good, I was a good basketball player, but I was an average NBA basketball player, which I like to remind people still means I was really good, just not very good. But nowadays I'm a psychologist, that's my day job. And as such, that's how I view the world now. And this conference has been really enlightening for me. It's been brilliant. I've been in a few workshops, I've seen some of the things you're doing. It's novel to see that in the workshops people are actually working. Because it's not always that way. There's conferences you go to where essentially that's coffee break. And yet I saw people really getting into the meat of some interesting issues in these workshops. And so it's been rewarding to know that you're here and actually maximizing what you're doing. Some of you, I think, have been fooled into thinking that it's what you do rather than who you are that makes you special. That somehow within your organizations, it's the fact that you are using your passion time, your extra time, your work time, if it's your direct role, to work on these diversity and equality issues. And one of the things that is highlighted for me with some of the people I've met here is how special some of you are. We often get fooled into believing that we are too small to make a difference, that in the scheme of the companies we work with, we can't make that massive impact. And then I come here and I see some of the people. There's a man here who's become a friend of mine in a very short period of time, actually. I've come to know from yesterday that if you stroke his beard, he purrs. You know who you are. But I highlight him as an example of who you all are, because I'm fairly sure that he's not aware of his impact. But he reminds me so much in such a positive way of some of the most influential people in my life, people like my mother. Because when he is... I told him he was going to get it today. But in reality, I was very lucky in that I had an extraordinary mother. She was an amazing person that made me feel resilient, brilliant every day. And that's something that you do. That's something that all of you do. It's interesting to watch as you interact with each other. You can almost tell how you bring the sunlight out of people. It's not what you do, it's not your role, it's your interaction that makes you special. I learned this at a very young age. People often think that I was destined to be a basketball player because I'm big. And I always tell people that I started when I was 17. I started playing basketball when I was 17, but at 7 years old, I knew I'd be a psychologist. 7 years old. Because at 7 years old, I would go on visits with my mother. My mother was a GP. And I would sit downstairs in the houses of families that had truly sick family members, and she would go upstairs and do doctory stuff. This is a British story, as you can tell, because our doctors actually visit you when you're sick. It's the evils of socialized medicine. But I would sit downstairs, and you could feel the tension in the room. You could feel that these other family members who were not sick sat there clenched, as if everything about them was about to fall to pieces. My mother would come downstairs, and she would always sit for a short while with these families. And they would say to her, Dr. Amaechi, I can't manage. I don't know what I'm going to do. How am I going to continue? How am I going to get through this? And my mother would look at them and say, no, you can do this. You can manage. You can cope. And they would say, Dr. Amaechi, I have no idea. My mother would just cut across it and say, no. And she would look at them in a way that, as if she was making the rest of the room disappear for them. And it was just her and them. And she would tell them, no, you can do this. You can manage. I'll be back in 2 weeks. We'll make a plan. We can cope. And these were families that wouldn't always have great endings. It wasn't always that their family members would get better. And it wasn't some kind of superficial thing she was doing as if they just felt everything was fine. They didn't. They knew it wasn't, but they knew they could manage. And I watched this and I thought, this is remarkable. How is she doing this? And this was in about 1977 when I started first going on these visits. And in 1977, one of the best things ever to happen happened. And that was the year Star Wars was released. It is one of the best things ever to happen. And the good Star Wars, not the crappy Star Wars. So I started thinking, as I watched my mother do these things, I've seen this before. What she's doing, I've seen this. And then I realized I know what it is. It's that scene in Star Wars where the droids are in the back of the speeder, and Obi-Wan is in the front, and they're stopped at a checkpoint, and they're going to get caught, and the stormtroopers are going to get them. And Obi-Wan says, these aren't the droids you're looking for. And the stormtrooper says, yeah, these aren't the droids we're looking for. Obi-Wan looks at them and says, move along. And the stormtroopers wave him on, move along, move along. It's like, I've seen this before. This is what I'm seeing. My mother's a Jedi. Like, this is brilliant. And so in this little doctor's surgery in Cheadle, there's a library right next door. So I think, I know what I need to do. And I walk next door to the library, and I tap on the desk, and I say, excuse me, to the librarian. I need some information on becoming a Jedi. And she looked at me and she said, well, the Star Wars books are over there. And I looked at her in a condescending way that only a 7-year-old can. And I said, you misunderstand me. I need some information on becoming a Jedi. And I described what my mother was doing, how she was dealing with all these stressful situations and making the tension drop in the room in a way that you can actually feel it, making people actually feel like they could cope and do more and be better. And she said, that sounds like psychology. And I was like, all right, you can call it that, and I'm going to call it being a Jedi. 7 years old, I knew I'd be a psychologist. The reason I mention this is because there's not much to being a psychologist. Psychologist, I mean, this is being recorded, so I probably shouldn't say that, but really it's just about the interpersonal interaction. It's about being there in the moment with a person. And sometimes I think you come to these things and I hear you talk about strategy and I hear you talk about initiatives, and I think sometimes you forget that it's just you. Sometimes it's just you. Yeah, it's telling you a story, but sometimes it's just you interacting with another person and just giving them that moment. We've all had these great moments, I hope you have, when you've interacted with someone in such a way and it's been as if their words are making impressions in your brain, indelible, there forever. We all have that impact. I have an advantage in that I believe everyone can do this, partly because I'm a psychologist, partly because I'm big. I think I can do almost anything. You guys have a disadvantage. By you guys, I mean small people. Yes. I'm aware that there's somebody 6'4" in the audience. He's tiny. Absolutely minuscule. And there's a real problem. There's a real problem with being, small. And that is, sometimes you can get fooled into thinking that you don't have any real impact on the world around you. I see it all the time. I walk through the lobby of this hotel, and I can tell as I get out of the lift, I start walking, I'll see a group of small people, and they'll be on their phones, they'll be texting, they'll be chatting to each other and walking along, and they don't notice you. I know at about 10 meters away, that's quite a few feet for the Americans. I know that at some distance, if I don't move, they're just going to walk right into me. And I know why it is. It's because small people have terrible spatial awareness. It's not your fault. You walk around in the world and it doesn't matter. You guys can walk along the street, and if you bump into each other, it's just, oh, sorry. Doesn't matter. Big people don't have that. When I'm standing in a room, if somebody asks me for directions, I can't just say, it's over there. Because if I do that, and there's someone stood here, they'll die. So, as a big person, you become very aware of your power. I mentioned this. I mentioned this because I want you to think of yourself in this way. Think big. Not just in your physical interactions, but understand that for some of you, you have titles that make you massive within your organizations. Some of you have charisma, some of you have informal roles that make you highly influential. Some of you can impact the way the people around you feel by just looking at them one way versus another. You have a remarkable power. It's unfortunate that sometimes we don't remember that. The good thing about being massive for me is that I know that at any time I can accidentally do damage. And there are really good parallels for you and your roles, and for the reverse mentoring that you're doing with some of your senior people, to realize that it's not just about getting them to say the right words at the right time, but it's about helping them to realize how big they are and how they can accidentally do damage, not even on purpose. So, it's important to remember. So again, in this diversity space, I'm not really a warm and fuzzy psychologist, as you may have gathered. I think a lot of times we encounter people, and I would say gladly not in this environment, but we do encounter people who honestly think that diversity in their corporation is a question of collecting certain numbers of certain types of people. It's a question of making sure you have that Benetton shot on the back of your annual report, the one with the black person, the white person, the person in a wheelchair, the gay. And that's their vision of this. So it's been really refreshing to be here and see people take it seriously and understand that it really is about a performance prerogative. I suppose the last thing I want to do, I have some time, because what are you going to do? I try and always shoe in a story about my children, because again, I've heard a lot about strategy and initiatives here, and sometimes we forget that it's the tiny interactions that change everything. Sometimes it's the tiny things we do in our workplace, in our home life, that makes all the difference when we're trying to pursue a goal as bold as the one we're trying to pursue globally. And so I will shoe in this story about my children in order to illustrate it, I hope. I'm a granddad. I have 4 grandchildren. Yes, I look good for it too. I confused some people earlier because my children are 32 and 31 now, and they didn't understand quite how that worked. Either I was a very zealous 6-year-old or but I adopted. And so I like to tell people how I got my kids. And it's an unusual story, to say the least. When I first got to Orlando, it's the team I played best for, but when I first got to Orlando, they just weren't sure if they were going to keep me. It's interesting that a lot of the reason they weren't sure if they're going to keep me wasn't really my skills. It was the fact that I was British. It's like, British and basketball, British and basketball. It didn't work in their heads. And that meant that at the very beginning of the year, we had this amazing practice facility where one half of it was a public side and the other half was private for the basketball players. But to get into the private side, you had to put your hand into this hand scan machine. And when I first got to Orlando, they weren't that sure they were going to keep me, so I didn't have access, except during official team practice. And I wanted to stay in Orlando, so I wanted to practice more, which meant that I used the public side. And I would show up there at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, usually after a team practice in the morning, and I'd go to the other side and I'd start working out. And then I suddenly realized that I started seeing these kids playing basketball on the other end, 10 or 11 years old. And I walked in the gym and I started shooting and I looked down at them. And they kind of give you that look, the look that children give you that's like, I'm not going to come over and talk to you, but if you want to come over and talk to me, that's cool. That look. And so I went over to them and I said hello. They introduced themselves. I said, hi, you guys should be in school, right? They're like, no, we're good. It's all right. All right. We shot around a little bit. I went back and did my workout and left. I came back the next day, and there they were again. So I walked up to them and I said, hey, Chris, hey, Eric, how are you doing? You guys should be in school, right? Nah, we're good. Shot around with them a little bit. It was great. I got to know these kids over the course of a year, got to know a little bit about their circumstance, which was difficult. And in fact, they came to some games. At the end of the year, I even brought them to England to come to my basketball camp. And on the second day of the basketball camp, my youngest, Chris, broke his ankle. And so I lose my mind. I call the ambulance. He's in the back of the ambulance. He's on gas and air, the kind of laughing gas, I suppose. So it's a really confusing thing to be around when a kid is screaming and with pain and then laughing his head off. And I've abandoned my camp completely. And I'm in the ambulance with him. And he pulls the mask from his face at one point. And he looks at me and he says, will you take care of us? And I thought, you manipulative bastard. You broken ankle, 5,000 miles away from home, and now you ask me? And that's how I got my kids. I ended up adopting them at that point. It didn't take long at all. I always enjoyed doing it because it was in Florida where gay people can't adopt, but apparently being a basketball player trumps all. The reason I tell you this is because a few years ago, Chris was talking to me on the phone and he said, you know why we picked you? I was like, yeah, I know why you picked me. I was an NBA basketball player. How cool is that? NBA basketball dad. And there was a brief pause. And then he said, you weren't that good. I was like, wow, okay. Well, that's all right. So why did you pick me then? He said, do you remember the first day you met us? And I said, yeah, I remember the first day I met you. You should have been in school, right? He said, yeah. He said, do you remember the next day you met us? I said, yeah, I remember the next day I met you. He said, well, the second day you met us, you remembered our names. That was it. I remember their names. And now I am a granddad. Sometimes we forget that it is the tiny things we do, the insignificant things that we do, seemingly insignificant things we do that can make our universe split, that can make things that were impossible a second before you did this act now probable. A pathway is illuminated in front of you that was inconceivable a moment before. As simple as remembering someone's name, as simple as some of the interactions you have on a daily basis with the people that we're trying to influence. I'm really appreciative of this chance to talk to you. I'm glad you got to see me talk so you don't, well, half of you are perhaps not as scared of me as you were before. And I look forward to seeing what tonight holds, Victor. Thank you.